So we will start now with our first keynote speaker, Raquel Rolnik, who is joining me here in the table. Você me diz a educação, sim? Ou prefere passar você mesmo?
Não, eu digo para você, pode ser?
Sim, pode ser.
Pode deixar, então.
Começa?
Começar?
Sim.
Bom dia, good morning, everyone. I would like, first of all, to thank you very, very much, especially to Manuel Garcia Ruiz, who was more than inviting, I would say insisting, and making all the efforts possible to be here. I'm very proud to be here in a conference of young researchers, so as you can see. And I hope this conference, which I imagine it would be better to speak in English, right? Right, good. Will basically what I hope to open up for discussions. So I hope we still have time now, just after my talk, to start discussing and raising questions among us. So I ask Manuel not only to help me, to help me with the slides, but also to tell me when 5 minutes, 40 minutes, so you can have 5 minutes. Okay, so what strange landscapes that we have that, despite affirming uniqueness and singularities in their spectacular and unique forms, they repeat themselves over and over again across the globe, taking over territories in such different cities: Chicago, Dubai, in the middle of the desert, Astana, Belgrade, Rio. So we are talking about the exact same products: international hotels, shopping malls, livable sidewalks, corporate towers, which are absolutely identical. So what do they have in common? They are, all of them, products that are capable to attract the wall of money, which is the surplus capital, which is floating over our heads, over the planet. Financial capital, seeking for interest to be bigger, to be a bigger wall of money floating over the globe, seeking where to go down, to invest, to yield more interest, more rent, this rent-seeking capital, which is now a very rapid electronic cloud of financial fluxes in a constant hunger for assets. So why oil sheikhs, sovereign funds of countries, financial funds of corporations, can you believe, like Apple, the industry of notebooks and mobiles, Apple fund, financial fund, is bigger than the sovereign fund of Germany, just to give you an example. pension funds, our pension funds, the pension funds of the workers, which is also floating with this wall of money, why this surplus capital has taken over, has colonized our cities, and what are the effects of the amalgamation of this cloud with build space, because build space has a very important role in this financial circuit nowadays, building something that Manuel Albers has called the real estate financial complex. So we are not talking about finance or real estate anymore. We are talking about something which is both at the same time the real estate financial complex, in which, and this is a point also that I want to point out here and develop here, the states have a very, very important and central role to induce, to create, and also to be part of. But what is the relationship of this taken over with the pre-existing territories in the places which are being transformed? So how were they captured? How were they transformed? How were they dislocated? And more, I should also address at the end what kind of resistance, what kind of insurgencies, what kind of movements are taking place today, what kind of materialization of the struggles around the right to the city are in place today, and how they articulate around this rather floating, not very clear platform, right to the city. So we are talking about a global, we are talking about a new colonial empire, and it's nice to talk about that in Portugal, without flag, Spain, Portugal, nor face is the global finance. It's a colonial, and why I'm using the word colonization and colonial empire? Because we are talking about a occupation force in terms of a clear taking over of and controlling some territories, but we are also talking about a cultural hegemony of a certain ways of organizing life, society, and cities. So this new colonial empire is deterritorialized, is in a way abstract and fiction, because this is the nature of financial capital those days. And they are speculative by nature. I mean, finance is speculation. This is the nature of finance, like the bets on the possibility of gaining an appreciation of value. It's the game, it's the speculative game that is the true character of finance. So it's inherent, it's an inherent inbuilt characteristic. And so this movement is creating what I call here, and this is the landscapes for rent. It's a movement which is global, so we can see them everywhere, but at the same time is absolutely specific in each city and its place, and it's completely embedded in the political economy of housing, urban, land, in each different context. And of course, we are talking about it's not new in the history of the cities the role of financial capital. I mean, basically, finance the buildings. So what's new about that? And also, it's not new what Harvey had demonstrated, the need for capital when we have crisis, and especially crisis either of surplus capital or surplus labor, to fix them with a spatial fix. So what is the idea of a spatial fix? Is the idea that at the same time we can face the crisis by opening a new frontier of capital. So it's typically when we replace circulation with railroads, we were at the same time opening frontiers, opening in grounds for the circulation of goods, at the same time wasting a lot of capital and financial money which was available at the time, and increasing the speed of circulation. So those are at the same time changes in order to fix something that was not going very well and increasing gains in productivity. But at the same time, they were also changing the way we organize our lives and our territories. So when we talk about the reform, the urban reform, the Haussmannian reform in Paris in 19th century, we are talking about opening new spaces for circulation, but also bringing a new urban culture with on the boulevard. So, but the problem now, and this is what is new about this relationship between finance and the built space and the urban space, is despite the fact that we had already, and in a very long history of relationship between finance and the built space, there was a barrier of fixity that should be overcome. So the question is, in order the space and the material nature of the space, the fact that architecture is very tectonic, it's very fixed on the space, is and has been always a barrier to make things circulate, pieces of the built space to circulate. Transaction costs, need for registration, paperwork in order to pass from one landowner, from one owner to the other owner, all of those were barriers. Now, we have new creative financial instruments that just overcome this barrier. This barrier does not exist anymore. So we are talking about real estate investment funds. We are talking about securitization. We are talking about a very large amount of different financial instruments that make possible the capital get in and out quickly, instantly. Is the time of a bit in a built space, and despite of that, the built space will be there, will not move. Just the capital will move, but of course, with a lot of consequences for all the built space around. So now, space or pieces of space are becoming pure value or pure expectation of value. A shopping mall. I can enter and go out from a real estate investment fund that had created a shopping mall. But I cannot go there and say, okay, I'm going to pick this part of the wall because it belongs to me. It's not. It's completely detached from the building itself. So it's something that represents the building, but it's not the building. But the fact that it represents the building in this virtual, fictional sphere has a lot of impact and a lot of consequences on the cities themselves, because, just to start with, we, pure mortals, have to compete for location with this huge amount of money which is circulating, and of course the possibility of this money to circulate. I don't develop that because I imagine that everybody for now is absolutely conscious of one of the crucial measures of new liberal reforms that promoted this possibility of this cloud to exist and to be an empire, was the removal of any barrier, any existing barrier of the financial capital to circulate. The same barriers are still there for the people. And we have this huge discussion about migrants and refugees in Europe. But the capital, it's not only free, completely free to circulate from country of country, so it's countryless. Then more than that, this capital is more and more detached from the countries themselves. The fact that we have tax havens. What are tax havens? Tax havens are places where you can leave your money there, leave your investments there, without having to pay any tax to any country, which means that no compromise, no commitment with any measure of redistribution or things, all those things from past capitalism, from Fordist times. So, but okay, we can discuss a lot about these forms. We discuss a lot about these wonderful brand museums and brand architecture, which is absolutely connected to this process, selling out over the world these new innovative places in this international marketplace and competition of cities. But now, for me, it's more important for us to discuss the relationship with the territories that don't organize themselves by these logics, or don't organize themselves entirely by this logic. We are talking about major part of the urban world. We are talking about what we call popular territories, low-income territories, plural territories, territories that are its margins, contradictions. We are talking about landscapes for life. And now, in order to discuss the relationship and the contradiction and the struggles, and yes, we are talking about an urban warfare, very unbalanced, for sure, between the real estate financial complex, in which the state is one fundamental part, and the creation of these landscapes for life, the space for living, the space for surviving, the space for prospering, the space for human development. And so also the notion of public space is very essential in order to understand. So what is the characteristics of those territories, and what is the clash between the two? The essential condition for a space to be able to circulate is to be entirely free to circulate. So entirely free to circulate in the market means clearly to be very properly, rationally registered in a recognized institution, recognized by the governments, of course. But we are talking, of course, we are talking about private property, registered private property, which became absolutely natural today. But if we take the history of the world or the history of the relationship between people and the territories they occupy, the territories where they live, we are talking about 250 years, which is a very short period, of hegemony, of one single way of defining the rapport between people and the territories they live, which is private registered property. So it's an hegemony of a model that started long ago, 200 to 300 years, 400 years ago. It depends on the history of each country, of each territory, with the enclosures of the commons, and then became, and this is very crucial for us, a form of property which is one of the roots, which is absolutely essential, and that was the creation of the Enlightenment, the relationship between property, freedom, and citizenship. Yes, we are talking about the liberal state, the utopian liberal state of the Enlightenment, where everybody would be free, means will be the owner of its own body, its own self, but also will be the owner of the land. So ownership of the land will be crucial of this model, and also, and with this, within this relation, citizenship will be defined. And of course, this model was absolutely revolutionary by its time. And this model, the liberal state, became hegemonic with the creation of nation states on 19th century and the spreading of nation state. And now, after the war, after the fall of Berlin Wall and the disintegration of communism and the territories controlled by the communist bloc, now is absolutely hegemonic in the world as the way states, as the way societies should be organized and ruled. And of course, contradictorily, is a model of state which is absolutely in crisis. It's clear everywhere, and the political consequences disastrous by now of how much this type of representation and political representation do not represent us anymore. So that the creation of this nation state and the creation of an idea of nation state, it was within 19th century building of nation states that the notion of public space, and I am coming here directly to the urban, came. And public, absolutely related to the state, because we are talking about a notion of public which is defined in relationship with the notion of private. So the same urban idea of organization is based on private property, private public property, in a way that the public space is in true defined as the private property of the state and lived clearly, practically, as the private property of the state. And essential for the governmentality tactics of the state. This is where urban planning is born. Urban planning has in its DNA this notion of public-private property within the liberal state. So the idea of, can come the bed? Yes. The birth of urban planning, I will be very quick on that, based on scientific knowledge of medicine, of engineering, in order to build up a territorial administration of the cities under the signs of order, rationality, efficiency. Yes, with very much in this thinking, there is the idea of speed, of circulation, so opening roads, opening more roads, opening more and more and more roads and expressways, and this is very essential, including with the public systems of urban transportation, very crucial to the idea of capital circulation. Also, the born of zoning laws, which is the destination of specific parts of the city for specific needs for capital circulation, and this was very clear during the industrial phase of capitalism, to set up industrial places, port places, places that were absolutely essential in order to fix a new kind of productivity for the capital. But at the same time, with these rules of volumetry, with this use of permitted and forbidden uses, forms of life, we are creating, together with the zoning, and this is also absolutely embedded in the DNA of the thinking of urban planning through zoning, a specific real estate products. So we are talking about the bourgeois dwelling, we are talking about the commercial building, the commercial center, and the allocation for land for those. But of course, we talk about, again, a contradictory movement in which workers which have migrated to the cities, free from their ties with the countryside, means exposed from the countryside, they were very badly lodged, living in cities and organizing and claiming and asking for better housing conditions, for better urban living. And then we are talking about end of 19th, beginning of 20th century, and the emergence of the welfare state. And the welfare state in planning, which is all the modernist undertaking of providing workers a proper way to live. So we are talking about, again, a contradictory movement, because in a way has a lot to do with the essential conditions of reproduction of labor for capital, but at the same time is also the fruit or the results of the struggles of the workers themselves. But within these mechanisms, the city became a reconfiguration laboratory commanded by the state. And we can talk about this proper, orderly way of working class living, which is represented by this modernist utopia that one day everybody will be living there. So urban planning was ever central to operation, and this is what is behind this operation as well, central to operations of desterritorialization. We can, and I cannot, and this is just a parenthesis in my talk, but we have to remember also how much urban planning has been an essential part of the colonialist imposition in countries in the periphery of capitalism, and I'm talking about Africa, I'm talking about Asia, I'm talking about Latin America, in which urban planning clearly set up the borderline between the ones included and the others. And the others has, in the case of this colonialist undertaking, it's not only a question of space, but also, of course, it's a question of color, of race, and also of culture. And the urban planning imagination, which is what we teach in our planning schools in the countries of the periphery of capitalism, we all want to have to be and to implement in our cities the welfare state urban planning of Europe, has a double meaning. It has a meaning itself in Europe itself, in North America itself, because it hides completely the genocide of Native American, it hides completely the constant genocide of Romani and other travelers' communities. It hides completely many other layers that we should talk about. But in the case of our post-colonial countries, it also marks the identification of elite and ruling class with the forces of occupation, and the fact that most of the way people live and exist are considered out of rule, illegal, informal. How can we talk about informal? No form. Something that, of course, has a form. So I think it's important to take that in mind because it's very important, the role of urban planning on marking the borderline between the included and the excluded, the proper, legal, according to the rules, and the illegal, the non-included, I would say the other. Yep, next. So let's talk about these landscapes for life, which have been marked by the presence of the other, which are organized by the logic of survival, prosperities. So we are talking under super mega scarce resources. And this is essential to understand. So it's not only the way I can organize my own life, but the way where can I organize my own life when two things are crucial. No money at all for me to organize my own life. Two, no urbanized at all is available for me in order to organize my life, because all urbanized land is, according to zoning laws, already predefined and reserved to real estate products which are embedded in the logic of urban planning. So we're talking about favelas, bastis, kampungs, slums, but also we are talking also about immigrant and refugee neighborhoods, racial and ethnic signs, sometimes religious as well. Identify life being lived under those scarce resources with, and this is the crucial point, with outcast, subnormal, in a very discriminatory gestalt. And I can give you the example of the official institution, demographic institution of Brazil, IBGE, which calls all these low-income territories as aglomerados subnormais, subnormal settlements. And this is the official word to say that. So it's absolutely discriminatory. In principle, is wrong, and it's something in which something is absent. So it's defined by absence, basically. And again, it's the urban planning law that provides the language and also the geographic language of defining those borders. Who is the outcast? Who is not? And what is the policy towards those places? Basically, when they are needed to expand the frontiers of the real estate financial complex, they are simply destroyed. So destruction, evictions, normally, usually with the use of violence in the name of health, because they are not healthy. And indeed, we are talking about very precarious places where sometimes you don't have running water and running and other basic elements needed for life. So in the name of health, in the name of legality, in the name of ecological preservation, because yes, it's not by chance that they are located exactly in the places where they should not be, because those are the places where the formal market is forbidden to go, so are the places available. But we must also take into account, like when I was in Indonesia, when I was in a mission as rapporteur to the right to adequate housing, I visited kampungs that exist there for 300, 400 years, which means much longer before the environmental law that forbid them to exist there along the river. So, and the option has been basically, can go? The option has been to transform this non-order place into orderly imagination like the North American suburbs, but also to evict, destroy these places, and in its place to provide massive housing complexes. And we can see that everywhere, and I have just seen that yesterday here in Lisbon, in the outskirts of the city, exactly the same type of architecture and urbanism replacing this place, replacing the territories that were eviction. But what I want to say is that, as a matter of fact, if we take a world view on this situation, to evict and resettle somebody in a building like those is rather the exception, not the rule. Maybe here would be the rule, or maybe in France would be the rule, but if you talk about Brazil, Mexico, other places in Latin America, it's not the rule. It's the exception. The rule is ambiguity. What is the ambiguity? The ambiguity is those places, outcast, out of law, informal, illegal, subnormal, they're tolerated because, of course, they provide the special condition for the people to live and to be able to work for very, very, very low wages. At the same time, guaranteeing that there is a line bus that takes them to the city to work. But at the same time, they exist, and this is the perverse part of it. The ambiguity makes these places in a permanent state of exception, which means that they are there, it's not clear if they will remain forever. And sometimes we are talking about settlements that exist there for 100 years, 150 years, that are super consolidated. But there is always a kind of dark sombra, shadow, you know Portuguese, a dark shadow around with a question tag. Is this will be forever, or sometime will be evicted, resettled? And the shadow and the fact that is not very clear if it's temporary or permanent, if it's there for good or not, if it's legal or illegal, makes room, for instance, for the police to enter there, like in favelas in Brazil, shooting in the middle of the street, looking for some drug traffickers, something that, of course, the police does not do in a middle-class orderly neighborhood. Also, make room that every insertion, every inclusion in terms of an achievement, which is the fruit of struggles and fights of the residents themselves, became a political negotiation, and it has a political coin in the political model, because you trade your insertion or the possibility of having been cut or not to the electricity, cut or not to the water system, having a new school being built there or not, with the vote and the possibility of bringing for the ruling class your vote. So we are talking about a gray space, or an Iftachel is the one that I think helped us with this idea of gray spaces, of terra nullius, of something that the order is somehow suspended over. And when an order is suspended, anything can happen in between. And again, planning is very central to this suspension, because those are the non-planned spaces. We are talking about a state of permanent transitoriness, which is a very important part of the population is submitted. And we are talking about a very discretionary and subalternized distribution of benefits and urban investments, which is very different from ordinary neighborhoods. But we are talking about as well the formation and the emergence of political subjects in their struggle for remaining, living, and ameliorating, in a kind of an insurgent citizenship that shifts every time from confronting or belonging, being part or mobilizing against, and navigating between those strategies and tactics in order to affirm their possibilities to remain in their territories. And eventually, this insurgent citizenship also has transformed planning. And the example of the special zoning of social interest in the urban planning in Brazil, I think it's a very interesting example of how this type of thinking and struggle get into the thinking of the planning themselves. But again, let's go to the other one, the fact that your community has been marked as a special zoning of social interest, which means, in the planning terms, that that place is defined and destined in the zoning law to be a low-income territory forever. So despite the fact that it's marked or it's part in the planning, that not prevent evictions with violence and without compensation. Exactly what happened, for instance, those images are from Rio, during the preparation for Olympics and the World Cup in Rio, where a lot of communities were evicted in order to open space to some of the infrastructure work that was built during this time. So again, we are talking again about the process which is contradictory in itself. We are talking about gaining in insurgent citizenship mode, but at the same time, and what happened here, and this is important, and I will be finishing my talk by developing and coming back to the idea of the real estate financial complex, which is the new way of relationship between state and capital, in each state became financialized as well and becomes a crucial instrument in order to open up frontiers and space to be taken by this cloud that I was talking about in the beginning. And one example of that is, here's just an image of favelas in Rio de Janeiro and the places where they used to live, and the Olympic clusters that are around there, and the places where the people that were evicted were resettled with the program My House, My Life, Minha Casa, Minha Vida, in the western part of Rio, very far away from the places where they used to live, in order to open space to this. Porto Maravilha. Public-private partnership with, there is a big story around it, and I won't develop it because for me it's more important to see it as a model, not as specifically in the case of Brazil. We are talking about this new mode of doing urban, public-private partnership, in which, and this is the essential part of PPP, the definition of what will be done in terms of content, in terms of forms, in terms of type of people that will be inside those operations is 100% subjected to the expectation of gains of the private partner, period. So that's the essential question of PPPs. So it's just not possible to talk about good and bad PPPs. Because the main issue there, it's not the result. The main issue there is the process by which the definitions are made and the decisions are taken. So yes, we are talking about, since the late 70s, together with the destruction of industrial space, disindustrialization, the imaginary destruction of workers' prides and the welfare state, and the breaking of Bretton Woods, and the rise of interest rates. We are talking about the conversion of state debt to families' debt, the dismantling of welfare state, the destruction of housing policies towards one and only model, which is home ownership, private-owned homes. I won't develop that because I have my book, Guerra dos Lugares, in the registration desk for those who want to buy it, which is a very, very long account of the whole process of destruction of housing policies everywhere, including in places that never had housing policies, like a lot of countries in Latin America and Africa, etc., and the promotion of housing as a commodity and housing as a financial asset and the conversion of the debt, the migration of the debt from states to the families, creating indebted families, the massive privatization of housing, and then the crisis, the impacts of the crisis, the homelessness rising in US, in UK, a housing crisis emerging in countries that had never had a housing crisis like that in the last 50 years, etc. And also the Brazilian version, and this is just the idea of destroying, physically including the modernist welfare housing complexes in order to open space to these PPPs, to these new forms of creating cities in order to provide a place for rent-seeking capital to build a new spatial fix. And the main issue, the main mantra in the urban planning now is unlock land value. And unlock land value means basically, how come such a valuable asset, very well located, can be lived by those very poor subjects? This is the main question about unlock land value. And of course, this comes hand to hand with the stigmatization of territories, which are not organized under urban planning, and architecture provides the language and the tools for this that. Yeah, we'll finish saying that. So, of course, we are talking again about the creation of these new landscapes. Let's go. But to finalize, I could not stop without saying that the implementation of this model does not occur without political and social battles and several forms of resistance. And we have several examples on reacting against the reform of housing policies in UK, organizing a platform to defend housing against evictions, which is now working on the issue of this new frontier of housing financialization, which is rental housing, which is affecting not only Spain, Portugal, but also many other cities in the world. We are talking about anti-evictions movements. And one common element of these new movements are occupations. Occupations of public and occupations of private spaces by cultural collectives, but by homeless, by landless, by the merge of all that in the same place. And they came as a result of a double movement. I think from one side, a very important movement that comes from art and culture in a much more situationist way, and dealing the city not only as a scenario, but also as a theme, as a topic, and a performative place to intervene. But also, and this is, of course, brings a whole new questions about how much this has been or not incorporating into a placemaking strategy of the real estate market itself. But again, everything is contradictory. But also the long duration occupations, the occupations of buildings for a long time, for instance, by homeless in São Paulo, they create a symbolic geography inscribing the messages of the movement inside the city. And it has also a dimension of confrontation. So we are talking confrontation in military terms, so it means occupy, means occupy some place in order to defend this place and not let him go to the other, but also to liberate this place from the overall logic of landscapes for rent, creating there and prefiguring there, in practice, a landscape for life. Alternative ways of organizing collective lives. Now, as a difference between the old movements, not only demanding from the state, but also creating counter spaces, contested spaces in a kind of a conflictual, abolitionist, insurgent planning. Those are fluid practice. It's not something that it's not very clear what are exactly the agenda, the outcome, and the future. They are practices that require nurturing, require valorization, require to create their own cultural landscapes and identify the elements which are there. So in order to do that, to nurture that, we need to decolonize our planning imagination, to get away at once with the development model of capital accumulation, which is Western, white, patriarchal, and to pay attention a lot with these new messages that are coming from below. Thank you.
So we open the time for questions, comments.
Thank you very much for your insightful keynote speech this morning. My question will relate to your earlier statement when you engagedly proposed the rhetorical question of what kind of resistance, what kind of insurgencies, what kind of materialization of right to the city, as well as what kind of movement. But then when touching upon this issue, we have witnessed many studies also, including my own research, dealing with the increasing power relation, not by the national state, but by the local state, municipalities, especially when the flows of communication, the flow of investment, and the flow is not ruled only by the national state, but by the local city municipalities. And then going back to your rhetorical question of, especially in the last slides, thinking about the articulation of this resistance, this movement, it creates a new dynamics because the common enemy, it's not that in such a dichotomy any longer between the excluded against the included coming from. It's more dynamics. And then based on your research in many countries and many cities, how do you see this dynamic and how do you see actually this movement is actually being hegemonized again to just being busy to face many enemies, their own local municipalities project, their own urban planners project, as well as the national and the global. And then it leads to my self-reflexivity to see how actually the scholars and academics also take place, not as a part of the solution, but also part of the problems in many countries. And then it's not a second question, it's just a follow-up question. In this new dynamics, we also witness that many scholars, university-based or institute-based, also part of this financializing state and financializing of the urban. So how do you see this dynamic of new power of local city municipalities in terms of this global tendency. Thank you very much.
Sim, vou falar em português. Tudo bem? Raquel, eu fiquei em dúvida quando você fala sobre esse novo mantra em urban planning, to unlock land value, não é? Se as ocupações seriam, não é, um exemplo. É isso.
I'll take those two questions and then we can go on. Thank you very much for your questions. When I was commenting about the role of the state, the problem of translation, I was not referring only at the national level, but also at the local level as well, and not only at the executive branch, means City Hall, Presidency, state government, but also the judiciary, which is absolutely crucial also in this, as a very important part, the legislative body and the judiciary in all the scales of the state. And indeed, the main discourse on our present state of urban policies and the political economy of urban is that we talk about decentralizing power towards local level, and that was a kind of reality for some countries, a pure discourse in others, because when you decentralize without providing the resources, without decentralize any resource, it's not decentralizing. In the case of Brazil, it's absolutely clear because the big resources to build infrastructure, to create cities is still absolutely centralized at the national level. But we have in several countries, and China is, India also is, very good examples of how, and this is related to the other questions of unlock land value, on how cities had discovered a wonderful way of making money and producing new infrastructure, which is basically grabbing land from the places where people used to live for a very, very low money and low price, and then selling this land in public-private partnership, providing the land, saying, okay, I give you the land, which in principle is public land because it resulted from expropriation. Expropriation, or eminent domain, expropriation that very rarely paid the price of the dislocation of affected people, and providing this land, and land is the asset, to the private partner, so the private partner could build the infrastructure, the road, the ring is the favorite, almost in everywhere, and be a partner of the whole real estate development that will take place in the neighboring places of the same land. So in this way, that was the magic, the miracle of making money and reforming cities very rapidly in China or in some cities in India, exactly using this type of mechanism, and I described that with some details in some cases in the book, in the case of Rio, Porto Maravilha was implemented in a land that 75% of the land belonged to the state. Part of the national state, part of local state, part of states, because in Brazil we have 3 tiers of government. And with examples also coming from China and coming from India. So the discourse is basically, money is gone. All of a sudden, money is gone. We had money, we cannot borrow money, states cannot borrow money, nor national state, nor local state, because they are indebted, and to pay the debt, we have a very low, and just because the interest rates were up, and it was an individual decision of US at a certain point in time, just to say that. And then comes the international advisors from the World Bank, from the International Monetary Fund, said, but you have a golden mine here. What is the golden mine? Public land. Use the public land, and if you don't get, you just expropriate. And for you, in countries where most of the settlements are illegal or ambiguous, it's wonderful to expropriate because you don't need to pay the land back to the people, period. You put them in some housing complex outwards, and that's it in the case where does it exist. So the idea of using public space, and public space is the main asset that is being used by governments, including local governments, in order to open ground to public-private partnership. Either the land itself to be developed by PPPs, the land, the location itself, or, even more perverse, the land as a guarantee, as a collateral, in order to avoid the risk of the private partner in the PPPs. So in the public-private partnership contract, in order, for instance, a contract to build a new subway line in São Paulo, in order to avoid the risk of the private partner that would receive back his investments with the money, the tariff, the money that the people pay to use the metro. If something happens, for instance, a big pressure from the people saying, don't raise the tariff or things like that, then you have public land, including occupied public land by people, as collateral to this private partner to guarantee that he's going to receive the money, the expected money anyway. Happens what happens. And also the fact, and this is very important for the question you were raising, which is the political question, the resistance, because not only we have to face trans-scholar questions, and a good example of that is how much, for instance, the housing movement in Spain, and I use the example of Barcelona, the Plataforma de los Afectados por las Hipotecas, but also the Sindicat de Llogaters, the new renters union, which is being organized there, that they have to face with a new landlord, which is a global corporate landlord, which is exactly the same ones that were behind investment funds from tax havens, the same ones that had invested during the bubble and had created the bubble, offering this massive housing to be bought by credit and by mortgage, the same ones are now buying the empty houses after the burst, after the crisis, for very low prices and putting them to rent. So people that are living there, they have to face Blackstone or Airbnb, something which is very abstract and have no face. You cannot demonstrate against his door because he has no door in the city whatsoever. And at the same time, the state that open up the possibility by creating instruments like real estate investment funds that provide the necessary tools for those global corporate landlords to come and create these new products and are subjected to that. And at the same time, with this very local planning committee that doesn't do anything to block this type of investments in the city. So it's very complex, it's trans-scalar at the same time, and at the same time you have to do all that in a context in which governance has changed a lot. Part of the perverse side of these new urban planning instruments is that contracts, PPP contracts, they are defined and decided and managed outside the state institutions, outside the state legislation, within private contracts. So it's even more difficult for the people to press, to interfere. In the case of, and they are becoming small and scattered, and they are not the big discussions about the master plan. They are here and there opening up for these new contracts. 10 days in the internet, in a public hearing is 10 days in the internet with what we call a Twitter intervention, because you have only 100 characters to comment in the internet, and that's it. No big discussion in the city council anymore, because all of those instruments are outside the political realm and the political discussion. So yes, the picture is bad, I would say. It's very bad. But as an Italian philosopher, I always quote, Franco Berardi said, neoliberalism is dead. We are living in a corpse. That's why it's so unpleasant. But neoliberal policies have no answer to the crises that are being provoked by this type of interventions, the environmental crisis, the political representation crisis. So I really believe that all this, and referring to your question, all these creations of landscapes for life and all the resistance of those communities to stay in place, to ameliorate, to manage themselves, to create new ways of surviving and existing, they are already a resistance. So we are talking about a new type of political struggle, which is not only the idea of organizing and claiming on the streets, we want this, we want that, but also creating and resisting with these creations in hands.
Hello, my name is Múcio. I happen to be a Brazilian architect from Recife, northeast of Brazil. I happen to have my own practice. I happen to be a teacher at local university, specifically of urbanism and architecture. To make it simple, 53% of the Brazilian population are poor people from low-income areas. Some of these live in what we call ZEIs, which are Zonas Especiais de Interesse Social. These are areas, shantytowns, favelas, as we call them, which have some infrastructure where people have the right for the land. Okay? And the others, they live in shantytowns with no rights. And other people live in the outskirts of the cities in H blocks, very far from the city centers. They usually take something like 2 hours to get to the city center in very poor conditions. But recently, we found out in Brazil that there are more buildings without people than people without homes. And this is a very important issue. And now we have the occupations, which seem to be a very interesting answer to force the liberal state to sit down and negotiate, something they're not used to do. So I just wanted to know your opinion on these occupations. I saw that picture, the last picture of your presentation. I was like, I might be there somewhere. That could be possible. And to make it short, maybe you could talk a little bit about the Occupstelite. That was very important. I'd rather you explain what it was than me. Okay, thank you.
Finished, so I will be very brief. Maybe you have heard about a occupied squatted building in São Paulo that got a fire and then collapsed. Welton Caldeira became a big issue in the media. And after that, there was 2 slogans from the homeless movement in Brazil, Movimento Sem Teto in São Paulo. One was quem ocupa não tem culpa, because the first reaction of states and part of the conservative media was to blame the squatters for the fire and the collapse of the building. So quem ocupa não tem culpa was the response, but also casa sem gente, gente sem casa was a very, very important response to that. And I'm sorry that I have to give you some details on that. Homes without people, people without homes. Casa sem gente, gente sem casa. In Brazil, according to the official calculation of deficit, and deficit is a horrible word that we should ban from our technical field, housing field, because deficit, the question of deficit, the question behind a deficit is the question, how many new houses should be built? That's the question. And of course, the main question should be, what are our housing needs? And one thing has nothing to do with the other. Nothing. It has something to do, but not everything to do one with the other. And according to this official calculation, we have 7 million homes as deficit. We have 6.9 million homes as deficit, and we have 7 million empty homes. So easy? No. Of course, it's not that easy, because a very important part of the empty homes are in the countryside or small towns, ghost towns. Some of them are not livable. So it's not exactly like that. But having said that, the slogan, casa sem gente, gente sem casa, is a powerful slogan. part of the occupied buildings in São Paulo today, they're not necessarily residential buildings which are vacant. A lot of them are commercial buildings or hotels, other things that are vacant because the downtown area, the business center, the corporate center of São Paulo have moved from the historical center towards the region of Paulista, Jardins, the southern zone, and now the new corporate pole around the Pinheiros River. And the vacancy rates, and this is very important, not only in the old historical town of the commercial space that are empty because the activities have migrated to the new buildings, but the vacancy rate of the new corporate pole is huge. Vacancy rates in Dubai is huge. Vacancy rates in Chicago is huge. Vacancy rates in Mexico is huge. So we are talking about massive construction, supposedly in order to everybody to have a place through the market. That was the promise. And indeed, a very important part of this built space does not exist even to be sold or rented immediately, just to be on the books as collateral in the financial circuit. So for, who knows, the sovereign fund of China or the oil sheikh fund, it's not important that the building is absolutely vacant today, because the question is the expectation in 20 years, in 25 years. But for us, the fact that it's empty is outrageous, because we need space desperately. We need space not only for housing, we need space for commercial space, for services, for cultural centers, for living, for everything, for markets, for selling, for doing any activities. And we don't get that. So occupation and squatting those spaces and transforming them into living spaces, I think it's a very, very important political message that is coming from our side, facing and confronting now the whole model of urban planning, which is producing vacant space, evicting and producing vacant space. And very briefly, the case of Ocupe Estelita in Recife. It is a public land that belonged to the railroad. The railroad was destroyed, and the whole railroad system was destroyed together with that. And the land was sold in a bid, illegal bid, by the way, to a private entrepreneur who used to place this very well located place because it's near the historical center of Recife, but also links to the historical center of Olinda, which is a very, it's a very important city as well, and surrounded by very low income neighborhoods in very bad conditions all around. And instead of providing a better place for those people to live there, those people who live around there, instead of providing new equipment, new places for those people to live, the proposal of this real estate entrepreneur was to create corporate towers, a landscape exactly like the ones I show you in Rio, Belgrade, Astana. And a big reaction in Recife took place, and Estelita, the land was occupied by hundreds of people during months, And, well, it's a complicated and long story. At least for now, the project is in a hold. Nobody knows if it will happen or not, but I think it was a very important new sign of a movement rising in Brazil around the right to the city. So I thank you. Oh, Rita, you come with the books. So again, just making the last advertise, we have a special price with discount of the book in the registration desk of Guerra dos Lugares if you are interested to buy. There is a Spanish translation which is out by Editorial Descontrol in Spain, and the English translation by Verso is already in the catalog, and it's coming next November, Urban Warfare. Thank you very, very much.
So guys, we are going to continue with the schedule. Now we invite you to get down to the main floor. We are going to have a very short, extremely short coffee break. To those who have not completed the registration, we invite you to go to the desk and complete all the procedures. Thank you.